There are several traditions about Jesus. For example, we have 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the New Testament. They all purport to be talking about one man, a Judean man, Jesus, and they all come up with different interpretations of the man, and those interpretations are contradictory. There are also 34 other Christian Gospels that we know of dating in the first 2 centuries after the time that Jesus lived, and there are at least 13 other Gospels in that period of which we only know the names. So there's not one single unified Jesus tradition, and it's spread out from actually being within the confines of Christianity, influencing other religions as well. The truth is, the man we call Jesus of Nazareth, the Judean artisan, is a historical X, an unknown quantity. His personal history basically is largely unknown. We know what people thought about him, but not really you have to dig through the Gospels to sort out things that might have originated with him from things that were attributed later to him. One, the narrative realism, that is the realism of the text, of early Christian gospel literature is not a historical realism, but it's a kind of romantic realism. I even published that. 2, the Gospels are ultimately not historical narratives, but they are confessional narratives. They are more akin to religious propaganda than historical literature. 3, the Gospels are ultimately based on the memories of anonymous persons whose oral reports, having come to the evangelists, are largely shaped to conform to the faith of the evangelist.
I think it is factually wrong to say that most New Testament scholars think that the Gospels are written by people that we know who wrote these Gospels. It's factually wrong. Most New Testament scholars say we don't know that they in fact are anonymous writers. They certainly were not the disciples of Jesus. That is by far the widest opinion. Here's something worth thinking about. The Gospels are written in highly literate Greek. They're written in highly literate Greek by educated Greek-speaking Christians living 40, 50, or 60 years later. They weren't eyewitnesses. Where does Mark claim to be based on Peter's testimony? He doesn't. Where does Matthew say that he's basing his Sermon on the Mount on an eyewitness? He doesn't. These are people who have heard stories about Jesus. They're living outside of Palestine. They don't speak Aramaic. They're Greek-speaking people living somewhere else. We don't even know where. Rome, Antioch, Ephesus, we don't know. How do they get their stories? Well, how does anybody get the stories in Ephesus about things that happened in Palestine? They've heard stories that have been circulating around the Roman world until they come to them. They're writing stories that they heard in Greek, not in Aramaic. 40, 50, 60 years later, of course there are differences in the Gospels. Think about who wrote these things.
Impulse for apostolic authorship. The church, the early church, obviously wanted to see its books written by apostles, if at all possible. What's really significant here is that all of our Gospels were originally anonymous works. They did not have the names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John on them. They only put those names on as soon as somebody came across 2 Gospels, and they said, well, this Gospel is different from this one, so what do we call it? And there was a good sense, a good tradition already that went back to the original authors, I believe, where they said, this is the Gospel according to Matthew, and this is the one according to Mark, etc. But those works were anonymous. Now, when you get into the 2nd century, what's really interesting is that anonymity seems to disappear.
Talk about the no corroboration part of the Gospels. The life of Jesus, we have corroboration theoretically for his death, but not for his life. In fact, there are no other sources that attest the events of the Gospels during the life of Jesus except forged documents and revelations. Even the Eucharist story, the so-called Gethsemane prayer, We have examples of those in the epistles, but they don't match up with the Gospels, and they seem to be based on either scriptural sources or personal revelations. Like, I saw this, like Jesus came to me and showed me this thing. So you don't really actually have corroboration, even in the epistles, which were written in the 50s AD, decades before the Gospels. You don't see corroboration for the life of Jesus. You don't see anything about no evidence of his ministry, no evidence of his miracles, healing, exorcism, parables. None of that are in the epistles of Paul. He never mentions them. The crucifixion and burial are only vaguely attested in the epistles. They don't mention who actually did the deed. And in fact, the source that's cited for those details is Scripture. It says, according to Scripture, we know these things. It doesn't mention anyone actually being there and seeing them. All other sources outside the Gospels just repeat what the Gospels say or what other people were saying the Gospels said. So there's no external corroboration beyond the Gospels for the life of Jesus or many of the central events that occur in it.
Η ιδιότητά σας πια την επιστημονική. Τι λένε οι ιστορικοί για τον Ιησού? Είναι απολύτως αποδεδειγμένο ότι ήταν ιστορικό πρόσωπο. Τι λένε, ας πούμε?
Υπάρχουν κάποιες ιστορικές μαρτυρίες για τον Ιησού, αλλά το σημαντικότερο για τον Ιησού δεν είναι η ιστορική του ύπαρξη, είναι η πίστη των ανθρώπων. Δηλαδή είναι σαν να ρωτάμε, αν το φέρω παράδειγμα από το χώρο της τέχνης, αν οι αδελφοί Καραμάζοφ υπήρχαν και έγινε η δίκη τους και έχουμε τα πρακτικά και είναι ή δεν είναι έτσι. Πάντοτε στον χώρο της πίστης μιλάς για τη σημασία του πράγματος και όχι για το ίδιο το πράγμα, το οποίο σε τελευταία ανάλυση χλωμιάζει.
Επειδή είναι χώρος πνευματικός και λειτουργούν